Thank you very much, Deb, and welcome everybody to, as Deb said, the seventh show of Building Conversations. I'm really pleased to have everybody online today and look forward to what we're going to learn as we go ahead today. But before I get to our guests, I want to give you a little bit of information, just a little bit about myself. I have been a CEO of Passive House Canada for the past 6 months. I've done a bunch of things before I got here. I've been involved in politics. I've been a journalist. I've been a consumer advocate, and for about 30 years was a public affairs practitioner and a business owner. And that has led me to a conclusion. When people ask me why Passive House building standards, I can say with utter conviction that passive house building and retrofit standards address many of the housing and environmental issues that we face today. And that's what's got me, frankly, so passionate and so excited about passive house building standards. Carrying on, we have two great guests today. I'll tell you, every week we get questions of our guests about how much does passive house cost? Does it cost more? The same? And every week we do our best to answer that question. So we've gone out there to two chaps who we've worked with before. We have Chris Hill. Chris is president of B Collective Homes, a Vancouver-based residential construction company. He's a certified professional accountant, a master resident builder, a passive house tradesperson. He's also a Passive House Canada director. And one of my bosses. We know that Chris has a passion for construction, specifically innovation and disruption that provides healthy, sustainable living environments. And Chris is committed to promoting and building high-performance passive house projects. We have Troy Grant. Troy is Vice President of Sierra Lane Construction based in Edmonton, founded in 2005. That firm has grown and evolved into a full-fledged construction firm that is equipped to take on a wide range of projects. Troy's got more than 30 years of experience in the development and construction industry, and most recently he co-developed the Corvette Landing, the first residential project in British Columbia to feature mass timber construction combined with passive house certification. And both of these gentlemen are here to talk about passive house, but specifically to answer questions and to talk about money. But before we get there, every week I like to talk about this, and that is people wonder about the passive house background, the passive house ancestry. And I like to remind people that passive house has its roots, some of its roots right here in Canada. Here is the Saskatchewan Conservation House, and Troy, being a good Saskatchewan boy, has probably visited this house. But this house we're looking at here was built in 1977. It was funded by the Saskatchewan government in the heights of the OPEC oil embargo, as governments struggled with ways to make sure that people could stay warm in the wintertime. And it's the learnings from this house that were taken by the European scientists, who many years later were also looking for efficient ways to heat and cool homes. And what we learned with Saskatchewan Conservation House, a lot of it has been incorporated into the roots of today's modern passive house standards. So those of us who are passionate about passive house standards take some pride in saying that Saskatchewan Conservation House is part of our heritage. The advantages of a passive house. I love to run this every week. Our slogan is build better, feel better. And here are some of the reasons why. You know, how do you build better? How do you build to passive house standards? 5 simple things you need to make sure about: that you have a super insulated building envelope, that you use high quality windows with good solar orientation, that you have a really good ventilation system with heat recovery, that your building is thermal bridge free and that the building envelope is airtight. And when you do that, you get a year-round stable indoor air quality and temperatures. You get very quiet and comfortable ambiance throughout changing seasons. You get substantial reduction in energy use and operating costs. You get mechanical systems that are simple to use and durable. And of course, all of that adds up to priceless peace of mind. So without further ado, I will ask my guests to turn on their cameras, and the three of us will have a conversation. And at the end of the conversation, we'll take some questions. So welcome, Troy and Chris. How are you both today?
Excellent. Nice to be here, Chris. Thanks for the invitation. Looking forward to the conversation. I have not actually visited the conservation house. It's out by Regina, and who really wants to go down to that part of Saskatchewan anyways? It's a little bit flat. You got to stay north.
I'm not listening. You two guys were at Vancouver's BuildX doing this similar type of presentation that we're going to do in condensed form today, I guess. I saw the audience reaction then, and how I think there was standing room only as people packed in to hear you talk about money. So want to recoup some of that today. So a few questions, and feel free to join in. Maybe what I can do, you can tell us in just a few words, give us a little bit of background about who you are and how you came to be a passive house builder.
So my quick background, I actually come from a business background. I did do a professional accounting program after being a lumber trader of all things for a long time. And then got into construction really out of the enjoyment of building things and seeing things being constructed. The world of construction's not very forgiving. It's also a place where there's a lot of waste, and I find there's a lot of place for improvement. It was actually a meeting with an architect. It was Allison from One Seed, who was based in Vancouver. She's now in Victoria, but does a lot of projects in Vancouver, that first planted the seed for me with Passive House. She explained some of the principles, and then from there, our company got involved with a couple of projects, and I kind of went down the rabbit hole. It started with an internet deep dive. I soaked up as much information as I could. And then I started to get educated. I did the 120A course, really enjoyed it. And I've done the trades course fully through and written the exam. I've also sent 10 employees through that program as well at this point, and tried to be involved in as many passive house projects as we can be. And then I was tapped, I guess 2 years ago now, with some of my accounting background, tapped to be a little bit more involved in the organization. And so I do sit as the treasurer for Passive House Canada right now.
Very good, excellent. So I know, Chris, you have a presentation that you gave, a few slides that you used at BuildX in Vancouver. Do you want to walk us through that? Because I think it sets the stage quite well for you and Troy and us to talk about money.
So this presentation was given at BuildX. I didn't do much of an intro slide. I wanted to kind of go through this quickly. The idea here was to look at a comparison. It's specific to the city of Vancouver. Our most common lot over here is an RS1. That's the zoning, and it's a 33 by 122 lot. For this purpose, because I'm most familiar with it, I chose to do custom houses, and for an end user as the client is what we really wanted to see. So in this area, our FSR, so the floor square ratio, is 0.6. It can vary slightly, and there's variations on that, but what we looked at is a 2,400 square foot house. Right now, the new bonus FSRs pushes you to 12%. When I actually did this presentation, that wasn't announced yet or wasn't approved by council. The other aspect that's worth noting here is a duplex. So we're doing a single family comparison, but a duplex is actually 18%, which I started to do the math, but these slides get quite complicated, so I left it out. But that does give you some more square footage on the building. What I did do in early January is survey about 30 builders that would be peers in the industry for their cost ranges. So it wasn't just coming out of my head. So we start to look at the costs, and I think what a lot of people forget is there is pre-construction costs. So it's a whole bunch of things. I'm not going to list them off. This slide presentation is in the handouts. What I found is there's quite a range in what people declared, but I think if you actually sum all those things up, your code built property is probably $75,000 to $150,000 for those pre-construction costs. When you increase it to high performance, I like to see an integrated design process, and you're also going to have certification. I think another bump that gets you really that difference between 75 and 150 is the level of professionals you're using. Arguably right now, the best professionals are definitely within the high performance range and can cost more, but it's just set the stage for a range to do a fair comparison. What I then wanted to look at is the construction costs. So again, it is a whole list of items. I've listed off a few here. The list goes on and on. When we do our budgets, we're using a summary of about 60 points, but there's usually about 300 to 400 lines of detail that would go into each individual estimate. From that range, what I found was on a code built house, there was about a 275 per square foot to 350 per square foot range from the survey. For high performance, I increased it by 25 bucks a square foot. Those increases I defined, I broke it down. So insulation, framing, windows, and air barriers being the primary increases to construction. But I also deducted mechanical heating of 15,000. You could probably argue those all day long, and there's different variables, different quality of installation there. But polling a few different builders, that they felt that was fairly fair. The net increase to being about 68,000 in our comparison, or $25 a square foot. Currently in the city of Vancouver, if I look at the rebates, we do have two pretty significant rebates. There's the Clean BC, which is through there's a various between Fortis, BC Hydro. So if you go within the electrification process, you get some rebates. There's also a near zero program, nearzero.ca, that also can get you up to $20,000 of rebate for doing a high performance home. So when I summarize all those numbers, and I apologize, I mean, this isn't a crazy spreadsheet for what I work in, but there's a lot of numbers on this sheet. What I wanted first to do is make it a fair comparison. So let's move the code to this larger house and start to compare those numbers. And what you see is there's an 18% increase for high performance on that initial range. On the higher end range, when we're looking at the more expensive pieces, there's only a 6% change. I would argue in construction, we often see a variance of expectations and quality and what we're putting into it that's significantly more than even 18, or it's definitely more than 6%. Even in this study, we're seeing a variance on a code built house of 36%. Once you've applied those rebates, that percentage drops even further. So you're getting into 15, and on a higher end home, that's kind of the upper end dollars. And I would argue there's homes being built in Vancouver that are $800,000 or $900,000 a square foot. But once you apply those rebates, the change is only like 4% in that world. So it's a bit more of an apples to apples comparison. As an accountant, I need to look at return on investment as always. One of the big things is the code built house is a smaller house. A high performance house is a bigger house. So that just naturally is going to cost more regardless of the high performance aspects. So that's what we're doing, is building a larger house. When I look at that larger square footage, which is about 300 square feet, and the market value of that, it's increasing your value in the real estate industry by about $300,000. My star is to remind me that is total square footage of the building. I have further learned the real estate council defines square footage as the center point of the building. So you are losing a little bit of square footage due to how it would be marketed. So this pushes the difference of the cost versus the potential value. I see there's about $100K profit potential in there. And I think in a duplex world, which I haven't done the math yet in this level of detail, could be even more than that. What I'm trying to show is that lemons can become oranges. On some closing thoughts, I wanted to say that most cost plus contracts, which is predominantly how we build out here, they're going to have a 10 to 15% variance from the estimated cost to the actual costs. The reality is budgets go over, not under. The point here is it doesn't need to be high performance. I think high performance is a choice, and you can make other choices in your flooring, siding, roofing. There's thousands of choices to be made in a custom house that could keep your budget in place and still build a high performance passive house. And that's what I'm saying is the variance in cost is much higher due to custom versus high performance. The custom aspect, these houses are one-off builds. This is what makes them more expensive, not necessarily high performance or passive house. And that is my, that's that show.
Very good. Thanks, Chris. And I'm glad at the end, you brought up that point that I sometimes hear that people talk about passive houses being much more expensive, but it tends to be because they are, custom builds and larger homes. So that's it. Troy, what's your experience?
Sorry?
I was just waving goodbye to you, Chris. I didn't know when you were done your slide deck you were going to beetle out so quickly.
No, I had a dog wanting to get out of the room quickly, so I got him out of there.
I get it. That's a great presentation, and it was a great presentation when we did it at Buildex as well, Chris. And I think it really identifies exactly what a custom house costs and why it's different. And if you're going to build a custom house, you are going to build at a higher per square foot value. In our company, we don't typically build custom houses. We have, but it's not what we do. So we're more into building tall buildings or high density buildings. And what we see in that conversation is that our price difference per square foot is significantly less than what you would see in a custom house build. Obviously, we have higher FSRs, and we're able to distribute the cost over a much larger basis. The thing that really drives us crazy is the demand for more parking, and that's what we see a lot in municipalities. We see, well, we want low carbon footprint buildings, we want sustainability, we want affordability, we want high performance, we want a new park, we want EV stations for everybody installed, and we also want one-to-one parking. So dig a deeper hole and put more concrete in the ground. And at some point, things become, there has to be a trade-off. And most recently, we did this in a community in Victoria where we had that conversation about trade-off. And what can we do to actually make a difference in the community with sustainability and greening. And this all comes back to passive house, because that's one of the incentives for the municipality to sign off on the higher FSR and the lower parking, is that we're giving you a building in a location that's accessible and market affordable and long-term sustainable. For the owner of the building, passive house reduce the operating costs significantly to the building. So we might see a 5% bump in the cost to construct, primarily due to architects and third-party verification. And even in the soft costs, you see it when you're starting to deal with in BC particularly, dealing with your housing agreements, your 219 covenants, and that kind of thing. The biggest struggle that we have with passive house is within the municipal side, trying to have the conversation about what passive house does and why we'd want to build to that standard versus a step 3 or a 4 even, because it exceeds that dramatically. So the problem there is that most municipalities don't understand how passive house is, how it's confirmed through architectural drawings, how it's built, so every aspect is always being viewed, and then how it's tested at the end. So we've actually had lawyers come back and write clauses that say that we won't get a building permit until until we're stamped passive house certified. Well, that's kind of a circular argument. We can't get passive house certified till we build the building. So what do you want us to do? And at that point, it becomes a conversation for the developer whether we say, okay, we're going to build to a passive house standard. However, our agreement says we're going to go to a code whatever level that the municipality is happy with. And we're not going to talk about passive house. We're just going to do it because at the end of the day, it exceeds what they want. Even if we fail a little bit in the testing, we'll still exceed a step code 4 as an example. So that's our struggle, and the place we see the real benefit in passive house in a rental building as an example. If you're going to seek something like CMHC financing, you're going to have a higher rated score with CMHC through a passive house build than you will with a conventional build. In a condo property, your resaleability is higher when you're running something as comfortable as a passive house, so you get a little bit more. Some people, I've heard architects argue that you get a bump as much as 20% in your price because of passive house. I've never seen that number. I'd love to see it, but that's not the reality. You might see something between a 5 and a 10% bump in price because you're running passive house, but I've never seen 20. So anybody that tells you they have 20, I'd love to see that number on a mass building, on a custom home. That's probably true, or maybe true, but on tall, high dense buildings, it's not. So I'm a huge fan of passive house because it gives me sustainability, it gives me credibility with municipalities as I move through the regulatory process. It gives me resaleability as a condo. And if I'm looking for financing, either conventional or non-conventional financing through CMHC type of thing, I get higher scores and lower interest rates in lending. So those are some really good reasons from a developer's perspective to actually aim at passive house.
Yeah. Excellent. And two different perspectives, one from a residential builder and one from a higher density builder. But it sounds to me as if what you're saying really is quite similar, that there's generally a higher upfront cost to build the passive house standards. As Chris is saying, a lot of it may have to do with the fact that this is custom building, and Troy is talking about that upfront bump, but then savings down the road, higher saleability, and really it doesn't sound to me from either of you that building to passive house standards is an impediment to constructing these types of buildings. Am I accurate in saying that, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, the first time you build as a contractor or as a builder, general contractor, the first time you build it, there's a learning curve. The reality is it's going to cost more. You're going to invest in education for all your people. There is a learning curve. My feeling, and the piece that we really stuck with in our company, and got a lot of buy-in from our employees is that, I mean, this is the future. This is, even if you, as Troy's been getting to, like, let's exceed the code. The code is the base minimum. It's what you like. Do you want to be building the lowest quality building you're allowed to do, or do you want to build the best? And it's really just it's a choice. And you can argue all day long what is the best. And I think Passive House specifically has set a very attainable goal that is the top at this point. I think once you start to, I mean, this opens up a can of worms, but I like this can of worms. Once you start to deploy Passive House with embodied carbon thinking and really good solid material choices, you're talking about a really, really high quality building that's going to last a long time, and it's maximizing the comfort of the occupants. And as somebody that builds things and is passionate about seeing how people live in it, that's kind of what we set our standard for, and it became just an automatic. And I mean, obviously, like attracts like. So the people that we're building for, working with, are follow that same passion. So it became sort of more obvious.
Yeah, great. And I know, Troy, looking at Corvette Landing in outside of Victoria, absolutely stunning building. You have said that mass timber is the future of building as far as embodied carbon goes. Do you want to elaborate for a minute on that thinking? And next week, by the way, we have a guest from the Canadian Wood Council coming to talk to us, and I bet we're going to talk about embodied carbon and mass timber. Carry on.
So I think that one of the things that I really, really like about mass timber, and particularly in conjunction with Passive House, is that just the feel of it is so much nicer than traditional concrete and steel building. It is more expensive. There's just no two ways around it. And at this point with mass timber, you need to be building something that this is my opinion, of course. I'm sure others might disagree. However, either you're building a custom home if you're doing mass timber, you're not doing a spec home in the $400,000 range in Edmonton when you're doing a cross laminate building. That's just not happening. And when you go into building high-rise buildings or very high FSR types of buildings, mass timber makes sense when you're doing it for resale. So a residential condo type of project. So it's a little higher end stuff. So you can actually recover that. You can recover your expenses because it is more expensive. Or you're going in with super inexpensive financing through like a direct lending or private funding that's extremely inexpensive, and it allows you to carry those costs. So that's generally the best fit in today's environment for mass timber. However, I know that in BC we're seeing some new CLT factories launching, and I think that we'll have more product available. I know that the existing providers are working hard to bring their prices down, but the demand still outstrips the supply, so the curve is the curve, and that just makes economic sense. I don't like it as a developer, but as a business decision, I completely understand it. Basically, again, one of the biggest impediments to dealing with things that are innovative, like Passive House or mass timber, is regulatory. Once you get past the regulatory aspect, once you get the folks, councils love it, administrations fear it, and lawyers don't understand it. So you spend a lot of time educating people, having those conversations about with smart people about difficult topics, and how do you, as a developer, you go into council and you're selling unicorns as far as a lot of them are concerned. You know, you're gonna come in with a negative carbon input, so you're building a carbon sink, and as everybody across Canada has seen, most communities have declared climate emergencies. At the same time, our residents still want sidewalks. They still want rec centers and swimming pools, and God forbid they want light posts and you know, all of that stuff. None of that gives you a negative carbon impact. We saw our federal government say, well, we'll just plant more trees, and that will offset for sure, but not at the rate that a small municipality, Victoria, Vancouver, well, Vancouver's not that small, but a small landmass can actually take advantage of that additional tree planting to the space where they'd actually offset the carbon that they're putting into the ground through just simple things like maintaining sidewalks and infrastructure. It can't be done. So when you come in with something like Corvette Landing and you say, well, here's what your net is for carbon, what you're actually doing is taking a global perspective of carbon trade, international carbon trade, where we say Canada, we have this many hectares of forests, so we're actually a carbon sinkhole, and we'll sell you some of our carbon offsets. That's what we're doing with these larger mass timber and passive house certified buildings. Is we're actually creating a carbon sink that the municipality can take advantage of into the future, which then again sounds like unicorns. So and that's where the struggle is, because now lawyers say, we want you to make sure that you guarantee that you can do this, so we're going to charge you $4 million in a security bond. Well, that doesn't make any sense in the form of passive house or mass timber. What does that $4 million really do? It goes into general revenues and buys more sidewalks. It just doesn't. So that's part of the conversation. I know that's a long-winded way to say what are the impediments. Regulatory is our biggest impediment as a developer to getting these things through for all the wrong reasons. I don't know if I answered your question even. I think I just went on a rampage.
You answered the question, and you actually moved into the next question I was going to ask you. We've got a lot of great questions that folks are asking right now, so I don't want to take up too much more time here. But from both of you briefly, Troy, you're saying that the biggest impediment to building to passive house standards seems to be around municipal building bylaws and understanding of the passive house way. I know that we've identified that as well, and we're trying to work with the building officials across the country to help educate them and elected officials. Chris, what are you seeing? What can municipalities learn from your experience, municipalities across Canada? What could they learn from your experience to turn those lemons into oranges?
I mean, I think we're very fortunate for the passive community. Like City of Vancouver has been, they've formed a sustainability group, and they've been a big advocate and really pushed it into policy. And I think as a business owner, when I decided to invest in passive house, then that was the education process, and all my marketing changed, and it was an investment as a business. Having the literature from the city supporting that made the decision make sense. It made it easy. It means it means it has some lasting power, because a lot of, I mean, let's face it, the honest truth is there's been a lot of green standards of building that have come and gone, changed. There's a lot of choices out there to do these sort of things. And I think for passive house, seeing it in a space that was supported by the municipality made that choice easier. It's literally written in their literature, and at this point, it's in their zoning and bylaws and code. Vancouver's obviously in a unique situation where they have a charter and they are writing their own code. It is BC code and a bit more, so that is a unique situation. But I think at this point, is really stating that's what you're supporting, or the direction. We've seen it in the BC step code, pushing to step code 5. It's having that direction so that each individual business can invest in it and have confidence that it's there for a while. I think it's a big component of it. I've repeated it, and it isn't a plug as I'm the treasurer of Passive Canada, but education is really important. And I think the more people that we can spread this message to, and I think it starts with the general stakeholders of the construction or real estate industry, because that's really what we're talking about. As builders and architects have been, actually I'd start with architects and engineers, have where this science has come from. And now it's starting to disseminate further into builders and other areas. But we need it to expand to further outreach of that knowledge base, so we can be talking consistently and effectively to the masses.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, so there's lots we can learn, municipalities and provincial governments, even federal governments, as we move this across. Deb, there are questions. Do you want to tee one up for us?
Yes, of course. Very quickly, I just want to mention there's been several people interested in the handouts that Chris Hill was showing. Just to remind people, if you sign off early, in the handout section, there is a link that you can get all those slides to. So
I also apologize. I realized that I was showing it not very large, and that's a screen. There's a lot of data in there. I am now catching up on chat and those sort of things. So I apologize for that, but it is in the slide deck. And within, I know lots of the faces and names on here. So if anyone needs to reach out directly, please do.
Okay, great. Okay, so we'll start from the top very quickly. This wasn't addressed to anyone in particular. What barriers to passive house scaling and becoming mainstream? What are the barriers?
Yeah, so I guess what are the, and we've touched on some of those, Chris and Troy, but do you want to have a kick at that again and succinctly, what are the key things from both your building experiences, large buildings and residential buildings? What are two or three of the key things, the key barriers?
From a tall building or a more dense building perspective, just the design. So the number of penetrations, the type of furniture that you're going to put into your building have to be well thought out. Your HRVs have to be well thought out. How you're going to passive house really is not about heating the building, it's about cooling the building. So how are you going to keep the building designed and mechanically efficient so that you're not overheating your building and you're able to keep everybody comfortable? So those are some of the challenges in coming to a passive house design. So as far as construction goes, it's just in the design phase, how much effort you put into designing your mechanical, electrical, plumbing, and structural is critical. And you can't leave things out like, how does your elevator operate? You'll note on Corvette Landing, we have exterior elevators and staircases. So it doesn't play in that, but when you take a look at something like our Shoaling Heights project at 12 stories, it does play and it makes a difference. So you just really have to do a good job of picking your architects and your engineers who understand energy efficiency. And once you have that knocked on the head, then I think you're headed in the right direction.
You've got it made. Yeah, and we hear this time and again from people involved in passive house, high performance buildings, that it always starts with the design. Chris, what do you have to add?
I think for us, for passive house go mainstream, I think this conversation about cost is getting over the stigmatism that being environmentally friendly costs more. There's definitely higher costs involved, and we're in a market segment or market change. That's what it's shifting perspective. And we do have a number of carrots, which are the incentives right now, especially in our region. And I know that my presentation and my conversation is very specific to where I'm building. But across the nation right now, you're seeing a lot of incentives coming through for the early adopters. And I think you're going to continue to see those, especially with the word stimulus floating around under the current world we're living in. And then I think depends how your time perspective looks, but there's also an aspect coming that will like when you're shipping the market, there's the stick. And I do believe the stick is coming. There's a lot of BCs, the code 2030, those things. So I think it's really understanding those incentives, applying them appropriately so that it offsets that cost, and getting over that perception. It's really just market perception that it costs more. Your flooring choice, depending on what you do, costs more or less. There's 1,000 choices. I think there's also the only other point that's kind of a tangent, but is in part 9 building, custom is expensive. I think if we get to more repeatable, consistent factory prefab product, it's probably a little bit more cost in the pre-construction, but we need to dramatically reduce our construction costs through that repetitiveness. There's a reason we don't see a lot of custom cars driving around. They're expensive. But you see a lot of cars driving around because they're built in a factory. They're repeated over and over again. They also are all unique. They're all different. That doesn't mean we have to have a homogeneous product pumped out, but we do need to find those efficiencies to really make a difference.
Okay.
Yeah, that's good. I like the analogy with cars. Deb, you've got a question.
Yeah. So if operating costs are lower, have either of you considered modifying your business model to include more build, hold, rent versus build, sell? And maybe you're already doing this.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And at BuildX, everybody heard me say that I'm not a build hold guy. I'm a build sell guy. And that's a business decision from my perspective. So when you take a look at the difference between build sell and build hold, it's as much as anything else, it's the business model of the owner of the building that drives it, and the economics that make sense to that builder, how they move their money, how they invest their money, what their long-term futures are. I don't think that my daughters are going to come and take over my business in 10 years from now. So for me, it doesn't make sense to build a great big portfolio of lots of buildings for heritage reasons or whatever. So it makes sense for me to build and sell. However, the folks who do buy the buildings are very interested in the hold aspect. So generally speaking, folks who want to build portfolios like the design with Passive House, because it keeps their costs down significantly. Insurance companies, property management companies need to get their heads wrapped around the operating costs of a high efficiency building, so that when you're doing your original budgets, all of the original budgets we get from property management companies invariably consider a traditional building at, a step code basic level, instead of the incredible offset that you get when you do something like mass timber or mass timber with Passive House, or just Passive House. Shoaling Heights is converted to a rental building, and we're still aiming at a Passive House standard, although our bylaws say something a little bit different, and that has to do with the earlier conversation about lawyers. So I think the model is attractive to people who want to build and hold. And if somebody is on the fence between a build and hold and build and sell, I could see something like a Passive House operating difference being that thing that pushes you across the side. Not for me, but for others.
Okay, and this again is for Troy. What is the typical unit cost on the customer's end for your unit buildings?
Right. So if we're looking at a condo, and so again, this is interesting. How long is a piece of string? So when you're looking at a conventional build, for us, we just take the market numbers and we use market resale rates. We run an average within the market. We pick a target demographic and we aim at that target demographic for our resale prices. There are some realities about resale that you have to consider in financing, and some of those things are like most banks won't allow a developer to run at less than a 15% margin. So we have to hardwire that into our economics. On the rental side, we do the same thing. So if you're in Victoria right now, the average rental rate is somewhere around $3 a square foot. Our buildings will run in the neighborhood of $290 a square foot to $310 a square foot, keeping within the market norms. So at the front end, as a build and sell guy, I do take a bit of a hit using passive house at the front end. The guy who gets the building after me, one of the things that makes it attractive to them is they're going to realize the benefits, which means I can resell it faster. So I see it as cost neutral at the end of the day, because I can sell my building faster at market rates. So we don't increase our price because we have passive house, and we just see our buildings be able to resell faster.
Fascinating. Very good. Very good. Deb, next question.
Yeah, so we'll jump back over to Chris. This goes back to the slide deck you're showing. Is the return on investment all predicated on the FSR bonus you get? I.e., if you're in a jurisdiction with no bonus, does this all fall apart?
Yeah, I mean, for this particular study, I focused on the City of Vancouver as an example. I think that example has been seen, and that's really the tool that the municipalities have, is this FSR bonus. That's something that's free for them to give out. So even in the Lower Mainland, we're starting to see that spread, that kind of thinking. So in theory, yes, it does. And I think you have to start to look at, to be honest, what Troy was just looking at and what that previous question was, in a Part 9 space, that end user is reducing their energy costs by up to 90%. If you start to look at the cost of energy and the net return on that, it's not going to offset it enough. I've been doing some net present value analysis, to go accounting term on you, and NPV, at the return on that dollars at a reasonable return rate of 8%. And it, on a smaller house in BC, it was coming back in the $20,000 to $30,000 range off the top of my head. Please don't quote me on that. And you're looking at depending on your house, you're kind of a $50,000 to $60,000 investment in passive house, is what I was showing on the previous slide. So it's not a complete wash. But that NPV analysis was over 15 years. If you start to look at forever homes and people living in them at the duration of the building, those values dramatically jump up. So it really just depends how you look at it on a time basis. And I think the FSR way with that incentive base is gonna continue, and you're gonna see it. Although, like, we definitely are seeing it in BC, I think you're gonna see it across the country, because it's a free tool that a municipality can offer as we progress in this industry.
Okay.
Right. I know, Deb, I'll just jump in. As Troy mentioned, the importance for municipalities in terms of reducing their greenhouse gas emissions, and virtually every municipality has been tasked with figuring out how to reduce GHGs. So Troy has talked about how building to passive house standards will allow municipalities to do a little carbon trading and offset their GHG emissions, which means that there should be some bonusing, there should be some municipal legislation made available, and it is more and more across Canada, to promote these high performance passive houses. But in conversations I've had with architects who are even doing the custom homes, one thing keeps coming up, and they will say something like, well, I was talking to the customer about a passive house, and they didn't like the additional cost of a passive house, although they wanted an environmentally friendly house. So I said, why don't we not build your $60,000 kitchen and instead do a top of the line IKEA kitchen, and take that money and build the passive house? Because in 10 years from now, When you renovate your kitchen, you can put the $60,000 kitchen in and it will be inside a passive house, but we can't do it. We can't build a passive house once the house is built. So my sense, and I'm not going to be the expert here. I've only been involved with passive house for a little over 6 months, but my sense is it's very much about how we sell, how we market, how we talk about passive house, and explain the additional upfront costs and long-term savings. Am I far off the mark? I mean, I'll leave it to you two gentlemen. You guys are the experts more than I.
I'd quickly add, in my dealings with the end user or clients, which is like it's weekly, it's defining quality. And so really early on when we talk to clients, we talk about expectations and what quality means. And to some people that is a $60,000 kitchen, and that's what's really important to them. They spend a lot of time there, they want to see it through. There are a lot of, most times, and it could be like attract like, but quite often we're seeing people that quality is the bones, it's the structure, and that's where we've really started to focus on the stuff that you can't change, and where the passive house principles are really so strong, especially in Part 9, about air tightness, about more insulation, thermal bridge free, your windows. Those are bones that should last for 100 years. The inside of the house is the reality in our culture, whether you like it or not, is we change the insides of our houses quite often. We're renovating kitchens, we're renovating bathrooms, things are in style, out of style. It just evolves and changes. But I think when we set expectations early, we really talk about what quality means. And for us, that's when we start to talk about that exoskeleton shell and the passive house principles.
I have to agree 100% with Chris on that comment. From my perspective, the quality of the build is king. And one of the things that I like to do is challenge our providers, doors and window providers as an example, to test their products to get them to a passive house standard so that we have more product on the market available to us as developers so we can bring some of the construction costs down. But at the end of the day, people need to understand the intrinsic value to having something like a passive house qualified or certified home. It's just going to bring you value every single day for the rest of the life of that building, and that's just the truth of it. You know, like Chris says, you're going to change out your countertops, you're going to change out your ranges, you're going to change out all of that other movable infrastructure all the time, but you're not going to change your roof or your how your house is sealed. Oh, you might. I mean, that's not entirely uncommon. I suppose you could take out a wall, but honestly, for most Canadians, that's not happening. It's the interior that's changing. If you have good bones, you'll be happy in your home.
Excellent, good. Deb, I think we have time for one more question.
We don't actually. We have a couple of lengthy questions, so we could actually get them answered individually, but okay. We are officially out of time.
We're out of time. Okay, well, thank you both for being here and for your wisdom on the costs of passive house building and based on your experiences with the different types of structures you've got. So I thank you both, and we've got probably a couple of lengthier questions that we'll get to you for some answers so we can get back to those individuals. And we can now say thank you. We can turn our cameras off. I'll finish up the presentation and carry on with our day. So thanks again, gentlemen. Take care.
Thanks everybody for tuning in.
Thanks a lot. It's been a great conversation, gentlemen.
Thanks. Great conversation with Troy Grant and Chris Hill. And I will end today's presentation by talking for a very brief time. I just want to thank everyone for being here today. People ask us about Passive House. What is Passive House? We are a membership-based, not-for-profit group. We're all about policy development with governments, with manufacturers, with our members. We're all about advocating for Passive House standards. We're very much about education and capacity building, and we organize events across the country, provide really in-depth member services. We have staff across Canada and a deep team of instructors. So that's a little bit about Passive House Canada. If you believe, if you like what you've heard today, please consider becoming a member and supporting the work that we're doing. There it is. We've got the screen back again. I will say that next week we have a really exciting presentation coming along. We have Peter Moonen, the National Sustainability Manager for the Canadian Wood Council. And as I said earlier, we heard from Troy, who's a big believer in mass timber construction being the future for sustainable building. So look forward to what Peter is going to talk to us about. That's it for today. Thank you very much for joining our show. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your questions. We'll see you next Wednesday at noon EDT for a discussion with Peter Moonen. In the meantime, folks, be safe. Take care.